Prison guards, what was the worst situation you had to deal with? My dad was installing a ventilation system at a women's prison. He had a nice chat and a sandwich with an inmate. After they said goodbye to each other, a guard told my dad that the woman was sentenced for life because she killed her husband and put the body through a meat grinder. Edit, I'm adding a bit of extra info for people asking for more details. This happened in 70s, and my dad was working under very lenient regulations. My dad and his co-workers were merely told not to interact with the inmates, but there were no significant consequences for them if said interactions happened.
That's an interesting story. The contrast between a casual lunch and such a serious background is striking. Your dad must have had a unique perspective on the situation. Those kinds of stories can really make you think about people and their lives. Working in that environment must have been quite different from typical job settings. It's surprising how little regulation was in place back then.
My friend's mom was a prison guard when I was younger. We went there our whole class, and she told us about how inmates would break down mentally. One story I remember her telling multiple times: she was on night shift, and was suddenly alerted by screams of help. The screams came from a cell, and her being careful she looked inside the door window. There, in the farthest corner, an inmate was on a chair, screaming, pleading for help, and trying to avoid something on the ground. Mom, what's wrong, inmate? Inmate, it's the chickens. Please get them out. While still standing on the chair, jumping and crying. Mom, what chickens? Where are they? Inmate, everywhere. Please get them out. So friend's mom opened the cell door and guided the invisible chickens out. The inmate calmed down, but as friend's mom closed the cell door, he screamed, "You forgot one." So she went back in and got the remaining chicken. Note, the inmate in this story was a big-ass biker dude. He was probably on drugs, but I think it's a fun story.
That's an interesting story. It's wild how the mind can play tricks, especially in a place like that. Imagining a tough biker dude scared of invisible chickens is pretty absurd. Your friend's mom must have had a unique experience dealing with inmates. It's good she handled it calmly. I can see why it stuck with you.
Not a prison officer, but my dad spent 26 years working as one in the UK. Brixton, then Belmarsh. Heard a lot of crazy stories, including how the IRA prisoners used to be. Mess strikes used to happen frequently. They used to cover themselves in their own feces, wait for the guards to go into the cell and attack them. They then just started hosing them down through the service flap. He also told me swallowing razor blades was fairly common amongst prisoners. Although one time this guy didn't think that would be enough, so he slotted a bunch of razor blades amongst the bristles of a toilet brush and then rammed the whole thing down his throat up to the handle. He lived.
That's wild. The stories about the IRA prisoners show how extreme things can get. Swallowing razor blades and using a toilet brush like that is next level. It's a harsh reminder of how desperate some inmates can be. Just a completely different world in there.
I'm not, but my friend used to be. He left, it got too much. He worked in the highest category prison where there were rapists, murderers, kitty fiddlers, the worst of the worst. He told loads of stories, but the one that sticks with me was the time an inmate who was in prison for child abuse called for help to see a DR. They guards asked why and he wouldn't say, so they said no. He kept on calling and asking, and they kept on asking why, and he wouldn't answer, so they kept saying no until he got real desperate. He didn't say anything, he was just curled up on his bed when he lifted the sheets up and there was blood everywhere. He'd been sexually assaulted with some sort of instrument and they tried to cut his dick off. Brutal. He also said that sex between the male inmates is not viewed as gay, which I thought was interesting.
This is pretty intense. Sounds like your friend saw a lot of extreme situations working in that environment. The story about the inmate is shocking for sure. It's wild to think about the dynamics and perceptions among inmates. I guess the prison life can be brutal and complicated in ways that aren't really talked about outside. The thing about their view on sex also gives insight into their mindset.
Not me, but a friend of mine is a correctional officer at a jail, and I asked him this question after 6 months of him working there. He said there was an old Asian man that barely spoke any English that bashed his head on the wall until he started bleeding and demanded to be airlifted to a hospital in Atlanta. His injury wasn't that bad, so they were able to treat him in the jail and tossed him in the padded room so he could not hurt himself anymore. I guess he wasn't satisfied, so he took out his drenchers and scraped at the wound he got from hitting his head on the wall until there was a 3-inch area of skull exposed. Needless to say, he got what he wanted and was airlifted out of there.
That's a rough situation for everyone involved. It's wild how far some people will go just to get what they want. The lengths this guy went to shows a lot about his state of mind. It's good they had procedures in place to handle it, even if it was extreme. Just a reminder about the struggles some folks face in those environments.
I had to do a maintenance job at the ADX Correctional Facility in Florence, Colorado. If you're unaware, with this prison, it's known to be the highest security prison in the world, housing people such as the Boston bombers and other high-profile criminals. But we were escorted by 3 prison guards throughout the facility, and they said that nothing really happens there since all the prisoners are on such high-security lockdown. Although, the normal high-security prison next door that we walked through was extremely nerve-wracking, and the guards wouldn't tell us everything but had a few bad stories. They said there was a stabbing about once a week on either a guard or another inmate. The guards also all wore stab vests, which they said didn't really help since now the inmates just aimed for the face and neck.
That sounds like a heavy experience. The stories from the guards add a layer of tension, especially hearing about the weekly stabbings. It's wild how inmates adapt their tactics. Overall, a maintenance job there sounds pretty nerve-wracking, even if nothing seems to happen in the ADX itself.
My dad never told me about this, let alone about him working at the prison. Mom told me about the reason why he quit, however. Dad was getting everyone back to their cells, and when passing by one of the cells that had already been checked and filled, his face was splashed by a boiling liquid. He had to be rushed to the hospital for his burns. Turns out the prison gave each cell a hot plate of some sort, and a prisoner had boiled his pee and threw it at my dad's face. After that, he got out of being a prison guard and began doing blue-collar work.
I can see why he wouldn't want to share that experience. Getting hit with something like that would likely change how you feel about the job. Going from being a prison guard to blue-collar work is a big shift. It must have been a rough time for him.
My dad was a CO at the ARDC on Rikers Island. Though this is probably the least vile or gory story in this thread, I find it to read like a 90s sitcom. My father had already worked in the adolescent remand detention center for a couple years, but one day he had to cover for the security officer, whose primary job is to transport inmates from their cell to the security hearing, and then to carry out a punishment if needed, bring them to solitary, etc. My dad gets to work in the early AM, grabs his traditional morning cup of Joe, and checks out the list of inmates to transport. Ah, a nice and easy one, he thinks to himself, as he reads the first inmate's name on the list. Let's call him Carlos. He knows Carlos from the kitchen, where he cleans and occasionally serves food. My dad, nor any of the other COs, had ever heard of a violent incident involving Carlos, and nobody seemed to have a problem with him. Caffeine in hand and a hop in his step, my dad walks up to Carlos' cell, where Carlos greets him with a half-hearted smile. My dad says, "Good morning," and walks with Carlos to the security hearing. He sits Carlos down across the table from the board members who would soon decide the inmate's fate. My dad sits himself down in the corner, reveling in the rare chance to relax and enjoy his coffee before the long day. Fast forward a few questions into the meeting, discovered on security tapes that at 0500 hours on Wednesday the 5th, inmate number 1079 washed his dirty shoes in the coffee maker, and then went on to make coffee for the day. Upon further questioning, the inmate admitted to having washed his shoes in the coffee maker on a daily basis for the past several months. Cue the most epic spit take of my father's life. Needless to say, Carlos' reputation tanked that day.
That's a pretty wild story. It's kind of funny how unexpected things can happen in a serious place like that. I guess not every day you hear about an inmate using a coffee maker for dirty shoes. It's a reminder that the prison life has its unexpected moments, even if they seem lighthearted. Carlos definitely went from kitchen hero to infamous in a hurry.
I worked in a juvenile detention center for a few days. One of the kids ran away, so while some of the staff went to search for him on the grounds, they left me in a room with about 8 kids to make sure they didn't try to run too. I was immediately pushed up against the wall by one of the girls. I'm about 5 feet 3 inches and weighed maybe 100 pounds at that time. This girl was probably 5 feet 9 inches and 225. She held me by placing her forearm across my neck and threatening to stab me with her pen. The other kids egged her on and continued to laugh and scream like they were in an actual nut house. They completely tore up the room, throwing papers everywhere, flipping the tall metal garbage can over and throwing it at the wall repeatedly, and jumping from the top of one desk to another. One kid took a shit and smeared it all over the wall and tried throwing some at me while the entire room laughed hysterically. A guard finally came in and helped me, but apparently this type of thing was so common he barely batted an eye. Just got the kids out and told me to go ahead and clean up. That's right. I had to clean the mess they just made, including the shit on the wall. That was my last day. I was really trying to stick it out thinking I could help make a difference for these kids, but after that incident I knew I wasn't cut out for it.
Dealing with kids in such a chaotic environment is tough. Sounds like you had a rough time trying to keep things together while the kids went wild. I guess not everyone is meant for that kind of work.
I wasn't a prison guard but worked as a jail deputy sheriff in California for about 2.5 years. I definitely have some disturbing stories, but the most disturbing aspect is probably how normal most of the people who commit the worst crimes are. One inmate was so normal and polite I figured he had to be there for something super petty. Come to find out, when he tried to admit his crimes during video arraignment, that he had something like 15 counts of child sex-related crimes on his own daughter and one of the daughter's friends. The guy was well-spoken, always said please and thank you, etc. And didn't give off any sort of creep vibe, some certainly do though. Anyway, I guess my point is that though criminals often look the part, they don't always, and it seems to be the worst of the worst that can come off normal.
You can have someone who seems polite and normal on the surface but has a dark history. It makes you rethink what we assume about people based on their behavior or looks. Your experience highlights a deeper issue about judgment and perception in society.
Obligatory not me. Used to live with a couple of prison officers who work in the jails for the worst of the worst. Once they told me a story about this guy. He was ex-military and left with no skills other than killing. So when he got out he became a hitman, and apparently an efficient one at that. By the time of this story he was an older man around 55. One day he was eating when suddenly this man from India attacked him, screaming wildly, voice breaking from screaming so much. The man from India was scrawny and the hitman was built like a tank, so naturally the hitman could have subdued him and killed him, but instead apparently looked confused as he swatted the Indian man's hands away. The prison officer I knew ran over to stop the fighting as she knew the Indian guy could die any second if the hitman chose to act. She separated them and could finally hear what the Indian man was screaming. 30 years ago you came to my village in India and raped my mother. You are my father and I'm going to kill you. The hitman, not struggling with guards, just stood there still confused apparently and turned to the prison officer saying, I've never been to India, let alone raped anybody.
This is a pretty intense story. The contrast between the hitman's past and the Indian man's outburst is striking. It raises questions about identity and the impact of trauma. The hitman seems completely caught off guard, which is interesting. It also highlights how unresolved issues can resurface in unexpected ways. The way the prison officer intervenes adds a layer of tension.
I was arrested for speeding, in Louisiana, taken to some small jail, and at the end of the hall was a solid, gray steel door. It had a rectangular opening about waist high. I saw a black arm extending out, bent at the elbow, and a white guard, kneeling down, clasping his hand with consolation, their arms pressed tightly together. The closest thing to hug. I don't know why he was there, or what they said to each other, but the humanity was so uplifting but heartbreaking. It was obviously neither of them felt like what was happening was justice. Just a soldier following orders and a prisoner reaching out for humanity.
There's a lot happening in this scene. You see a mix of desperation and empathy between the guard and the prisoner. It's interesting how a simple gesture can convey more than words. The situation highlights the complexities of justice and human connection in tough circumstances. It's a raw moment that shows the struggle to find compassion in a harsh environment. Overall, it's a thought-provoking snapshot of life.
I've heard that juvie can be pretty violent. My ex's nephew went into juvie when he was like 12 or 13. He was only supposed to be in for a couple years. I am sure I don't know all the details. My in-laws told me that it was because he, supposedly, touched his sister inappropriately. I think there was probably more to it. Then, near the time when he's supposed to be released, he attacks a female guard. I don't think they should even have female guards at a male juvie center. Again, I don't know the details, but he had to stay in until he was 18, and the female guard was so messed up over it that she quit. According to my in-laws, he's just misunderstood, and he's really a sweet kid. Right.
The story reflects some complex dynamics. It's tough to judge what really happened without knowing the full context. Juvie can be harsh, and incidents like these show how things can escalate. The idea of a misunderstood kid is interesting, but actions often speak louder than words. It's hard to reconcile the two perspectives, especially when someone's hurt in the process. It's a complicated situation for everyone involved.
Inmate said that to me on my first day as a shit test. He was the shot called for a white supremacist gang. I said I could have two on my way here, but Hondas and their safety rating. I'd hate to be alive and a vegetable. He laughed and said, "Nice, you think on your feet." We were cool after that, and he told his people not to shit test me and I was cool. The inmates want to see how you react to threats and pressure, and if you can handle being surrounded by people you know could kill you. The trick is not giving them a reason to hurt you and that you stay consistent in your decision making regardless of who did what. You would punish them fairly across the board.
The story gives an insight into navigating tough situations in prison. Handling pressure and threats with quick thinking seems crucial. It's interesting how a bit of humor can change the dynamic. Establishing respect early on appears to make things easier later. It's all about balance and making sure everyone understands the rules. Staying consistent helps in maintaining authority without provoking unnecessary hostility.
Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, aka the Moore's murderers, are another delightful pair. The saddest part for me was one child called Keith Johnson whose body was never found despite years of questioning. His mother died a couple of years ago without ever being able to properly bury her son. Fun fact, the most prolific killer in UK history is believed to be Dr. Harold Shipman. He used to kill his elderly patients and then change their wills so that he inherited some/all of their estate. I can't remember how many people he was subsequently convicted of killing, but he is suspected in over 500 deaths, or so a doctor friend of mine told me. I might be wrong. He committed suicide in prison a few years ago.
It's unsettling how some stories can be so dark. The case of Keith Johnson really hits hard, especially for his mother. As for Dr. Harold Shipman, it's chilling to think about a trusted doctor abusing his position like that. The sheer number of suspected victims is staggering. Makes you wonder about the trust people place in their caregivers.
Yeah, it was pretty surreal to have someone talking to you and walking around collapsed dead in the blink of an eye. At first we thought he had hoarded medication and killed himself or something. He had passed out in his cell, and when we got there he was awake but a little disoriented. We called for medical and a wheelchair. In prison, medical takes their time getting anywhere. Once they got there he insisted on walking. We escorted him out of his cell. He was kind of sluggish but seemed okay. Then he collapsed and died. After the investigation and everything, we were told there was nothing anyone could have done.
That's a tough situation. It's strange how quickly things can change. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. It must have been hard to deal with, especially not knowing what was going to happen next.
2 prison equals not gay. Gay, you subtracted prison from both sides, but the left side has a negative prison on it. If you add to both sides and then subtract gay from both sides, you get the above. Alternate versions: 2 prison plus not gay equals gay. Gay, not gay equals -2 prison, not gay, /2, gay /2 equals prison, written as code because Reddit keeps treating them as and attempting to make a bullet point list. As to paraphrase my math books, the interpretation is left to the reader. Edited to fix the formatting.
This looks like a play on words involving math and social concepts. The equations are humorous and a bit tricky, mixing terms in unexpected ways. It's interesting how combining such elements can create a new perspective. Overall, a unique take on logic and relationships, though not sure how practical it is.